There's actually more chapters than I thought, so I'm going to keep reading. This chapter is called The Lost Are Found. Okay, here's a picture. All right, the knocking was far away, but it was distinct and clear. Edward and Eleanor started downstairs, but Aunt Lily was ahead of them. She swept down the stairs hall before them, tying the ribbons of her dressing gown, her hair hanging loosely to her waist. Down the stairs she went, past Percival and Mrs. Truth. Eddie and Eleanor hung back and peered down the stairs. Who could it be? Aunt Lily turned on the porch light and reached out for the handle of the front door. Then she stopped and put a hand to her heart. Through the glass, she could see 3 figures standing outside waiting for her to open the door. Then, with shaking hands, she opened it slowly and stood back. There was a tall man standing there wearing a turban on his head. Beside him stood another man almost as tall. His hair was dark red. And there was a woman in a white dress with her hair that was reddish gold. The tall man in the turban stepped inside. He was looking at Aunt Lily with tears in his eyes. "Lily," he said brokenly, "you are more beautiful than ever." But Aunt Lily was twisting her hands in front of her dressing gown. "Where were you?" she said. "Oh, tell me where on earth you've been, the 3 of you." "We have been prisoners," said the man in the turban, "but now we are free and we've come back home again." Then he put his arms around Aunt Lily and kissed her. "Oh, Lily," said the woman in the white dress, and she kissed Aunt Lily too, and so did the man with the red hair. Eddie and Eleanor looked between the bars of the stair railing and wondered. The tall man was Prince Krishna. But where was Ned and Nora, and who were these 2 strangers? But now Aunt Lily was calling them in a trembling voice to come downstairs and meet their Aunt Nora and their Uncle Ned. Aunt Nora? Uncle Ned? How terrible! Eleanor and Edward looked at each other in dismay. Then they went downstairs and shook hands politely. Why weren't Ned and Nora children like themselves? But of course, they had been children when they were lost, and that was a long time ago. Of course, they would be grown up. In all this time, Eddie stared up at his good-looking, friendly new uncle and tried not to mind. And Eleanor was kissed by her beautiful aunt with the golden red hair, and she too tried to forget the little St. Nicholas girl in the picture. Then Uncle Freddie, aroused by the noise, shuffled downstairs. He was struck all of in a heap and cried and pulled a bandana handkerchief out of his bathrobe pocket. He kissed everyone again, and Prince Krishna embraced him with a new look of pain on his face and tenderness. Eleanor realized that, of course, he hadn't known that Uncle Freddie was a little crazy until now. Then Prince Krishna turned to the stairway. He looked up at the face of Mrs. Truth. "I think we need a little more light," he said. Eddie started to tell him about the wiring and the burned-out bulb, but then he stopped. The light was on. Prince Krishna had turned the switch, and Mrs. Truth's star was shining once again, flooding the big, dark hall with incandescent light. Prince Krishna smiled up at Mrs. Truth, and then he started to run up the stairs. He bounded up them, taking 3 at a time. Where was he going? Edward and Eleanor ran after him. Uncle Ned took Lily's hand. "It's all right," he said. Prince Krishna seemed to know just where he was going and how to get there. He walked swiftly along the balcony to the attic door, and then he ran up those stairs too, with Edward and Eleanor at his heels. He climbed right up the steps and stood up in the small tower room, looking very tall. There was just enough dawn light coming through the clear glass pane of the keyhole window so that they could see. They looked around fearfully. Would there be something lying on the floor, something dark and terrible? But there was nothing there. Prince Krishna was looking for something else. He strode across the room to the jack-in-the-box. "Oh, look," said Eleanor softly. The Jack-in-the-Box was greatly changed. The lid was open and the spring was drooping over the edge of the box. The head lolled about on the floor. Prince Krishna lifted it a little way with his foot and let it fall. It flopped on the floor and lay still. There was no strength left in it. The spring had sprung. Picking it up with his hands, Prince Krishna dropped it down inside the box, and it just lay there in a state of limp collapse. Gently then he let the lid fall. There was no need to even hook it. The Jack-in-the-Box was nothing now but a child's plaything, and a broken one at that. Then Prince Krishna straightened up and turned to the children. He was so magnificent in his black coat and his turban with his peacock feather. His eyes were so wise and his look so simple and kind that Eleanor felt quite overcome. He was older too. She could see that now. There was wrinkles beside his eyes and thoughtful lines across his forehead. "Is this your room?" he said, looking at Edward. "Yes," said Edward shyly, "mine and Eleanor's." Prince Krishna smiled at Eleanor. He kissed her cheek, and then he shook Eddie's hand. "I'm very glad to meet you," he said. Then they went downstairs. Uncle Freddie had brought Waldo and Henry in from the out of doors and set them up in their old places beside the fireplace. And now the reunion was complete. The family party walked through the velvet curtain and stood together in the faded splendor of the parlor. Aunt Lily, looking radiant and hardly older than Eleanor, made everyone sit down. Then Prince Krishna started to talk. His voice was low and intense, and as he talked, all the years melted away, the years during which Aunt Lily had wondered, the years during which she had yearned over the lost children and Prince Krishna as she began to understand what happened to them. "We were imprisoned by my uncle," said Prince Krishna. "Your uncle?" said Aunt Lily. "His name was Jacaranda. He was my father's brother." Jacaranda. The name was unfamiliar, but the sound of it brought before Eleanor and Edward the vision of a face, the face of the man in the dream who had fallen on his sword. Prince Krishna's story began with a letter that had come to him one day in that time long ago when he had been a guest at Aunt Lily's house. It was a letter from his uncle, and the envelope was edged in black. It bore the tragic news that Prince Krishna's father was dead. Then the letter went on with a proposal. Prince Jacaranda begged Krishna to give up his right of succession, to step aside in favor of himself as the next Maharaja, and to give up to him the state treasures that were in his possession. Prince Krishna had been grief-stricken. He had answered the letter at great length, pouring out his grief, and he had confessed to his uncle his sorrow at leaving behind the new friends for whom he had come to love, and the dread of the grandeur and ceremony that would accompany his new duties as a Maharaja. He described to Prince Jacaranda the happiness in the good and simple life he had found in Concord, his joy in his newfound friend, his love for Lily, his fondness for the children, his pleasure in the games that they had played together. He reminded his uncle that he too, as a child, had played the same games, the old games that were traditional in the family of the Maharaja. But he had told him that in spite of his sorrow, he would return to India and take up the burden himself. He had refused Jacaranda's request. "But what for?" said Eddie. "Because my uncle was an evil man," said the Prince Krishna. "I knew how terribly my countrymen would suffer from his greed and tyranny. I could not sacrifice their good for my own." "What did he do then?" said Eleanor. Prince Krishna glanced at Ned and Nora. They were sitting soberly beside him, listening. His face looked haggard. He did something very strange. He sent a present to the children. "It was the Jack-in-the-Box." Prince Krishna nodded gravely. "The Jack-in-the-Box, indeed," he said. "It became his viceroy, his representative, a villainous copy of himself in plaster and wood and coiled wire, and he used it to capture the children." Prince Krishna's voice betrayed his anguish. "It was my fault," he said bitterly. "If they had not befriended me, it would have never happened. But we had become very fond of one another, and they were my friends, my young companions. To amuse them, I played with them the kind of games I had known as a child myself. And the children were very clever. I had to make the games harder and harder. At last, I invented one that was the hardest of all, and they were eager to begin. Innocently, they set out on it alone. One by one, they sought and found the baubles and treasures I had hidden for them. But in my ignorance, I did not know how dearly they were bought with danger. My pleasant little trails had become nightmare journeys, fatal and terrible. Trusting me, the children did not complain. Instead, they went on and on until they were trapped, kidnapped, and lost. Only then did I become aware of what was happening. Only then, when the children were gone. And then my uncle wrote to me again. Prince Krishna sank his head into his hands. He threatened me, he said. If I would agree to his demands, he would release the children. Otherwise, I too would be imprisoned. Sick at heart, I wrote to him and put him off day after day. Desperately, I tried to find them and rescue them myself. I entered myself upon the game we had played, followed the trails, and discovering at every turn the dreadful shapes my patterns had taken. And at last my attempts failed. My uncle fulfilled his threat, and I too was caught and imprisoned. Prince Krishna straightened up and looked at Aunt Lily. But now it's all over at last, he said. His smile went around the room to include Edward and Eleanor, and they felt a rush of devotion to this new and remarkable friend. But what was it like? Said Aunt Lily with a gesture of concern. Were you imprisoned in India? Why didn't he kill you? And oh, Nora dear, how did you endure it? We've missed you so. Nora looked at her gravely. We weren't uncomfortable at all, she said, and we think that someone has been helping us for a long time. Yes, said Ned, one by one the doors that shut us in have been unlocked until there was only one door left, and tonight that one, too, was broken open. And here we are. Aunt Lily was bewildered. But who set you free? She said. Prince Krishna looked at Eleanor. She blushed. Then he turned slowly and looked at Edward. Edward turned red too and grinned. Prince Krishna smiled broadly at them. Whoever they were, he said, they were true friends and very gallant ones indeed. Eleanor felt glad. She couldn't look at Prince Krishna. She was too shy. She looked instead at the peacock feather on his hat, and the peacock feather seemed to be looking back at her. There was an eye in the middle of it, a blue eye with a pupil of dark iridescent green, and there was a dash of yellow like highlight across the green. Eye of bird, eye of fowl hides the treasure chest. Why, a peacock had more than 2 eyes. He had dozens in his tail. All right, that's that chapter. I'm really going to figure out how many. Okay, we got 1 more, 2 more, 3 more chapters. Okay, of The Diamond in the Window by Jane Langton.